When Barron Trump stepped into the upscale restaurant in New York City, the city itself seemed to play its own symphony. The hum of car engines, the shuffle of footsteps on the sidewalks, and the muffled conversations drifting through windows all created the unmistakable rhythm of a bustling metropolis. The day was clear but cold, as it often is in early spring, when the sun begins to warm, streets lined with coffee shops and boutique storefronts. Barron, tall and self-assured, strode through the restaurant's massive doors, a place known for its blend of classic elegance and modern sophistication. It was a magnet for business moguls, artists, and other influential figures, and every table seemed to hold a story of its own. This wasn't Barron's first time here. He appreciated the tranquility and impeccable service the place offered. But today, his entrance didn't go unnoticed. Perched on his head was a bright red magician's hat, a whimsical accessory he wore with effortless confidence. It wasn't just a piece of his wardrobe, it was something more, a statement of his individuality, bold youthfulness, and inner freedom. Yet in a room full of refined patrons, the hat immediately caught attention. Taking his usual seat by the window, he opened the menu. His movements were unhurried, and his face showed calm concentration. But at a nearby table, a man nudged his companion with an elbow and whispered something, barely suppressing a smirk. Barron either didn't notice or chose to ignore them. At that moment, the restaurant manager approached swiftly. He was a man in his 40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, his expression a mix of nervousness and determination. His voice was loud enough to catch the attention of nearby diners. "Excuse me, sir, but we have a policy prohibiting political symbolism. I must ask you to remove your hat." Barron looked up, his gaze calm but tinged with genuine surprise. "Political symbolism," he repeated, his voice steady and soft. "It's outlined in our code of conduct," the manager added, gesturing toward a sign near the entrance. "We aim to maintain a neutral environment for all our guests." Barron considered the statement for a moment. His eyes scanned the room. Some diners pretended not to notice and continued their meals, while others stared directly at him. "I wasn't trying to break any rules," he said at last, his tone even and measured. "If it's a problem, I'll leave." He stood up calmly, his movements deliberate and poised. Collecting his belongings, Barron left the untouched glass of water on the table. As he passed the manager, he gave him a slight nod, saying nothing more. When the restaurant door closed behind him, a palpable tension lingered inside, hanging in the air like a thick fog. Outside, Barron paused. The cold New York wind brushed against his face, a stark reminder that this city, with its boundless opportunities and invisible barriers, was always ready to test your resilience. He adjusted his hat, as if sealing his decision with a final punctuation mark. The gesture, almost imperceptible to passers-by, reflected his inner calm and steadfast confidence. Barron took a deep breath of the crisp New York air. He wasn't angry. He didn't have the energy for that. Instead, he felt a wave of disappointment, as if the world he believed in had shifted slightly off balance. He'd been raised to respect people, even when disagreements arose. But today, that belief felt betrayed. Back in the restaurant, an uneasy tension lingered. Behind the bar, the bartender leaned closer to the manager and quietly asked, "Are you sure that was the right call? Do you even know who he is?" The manager dismissed the question with a wave of his hand, not even sparing the bartender a glance. "We have rules and there can't be exceptions. If we allow this, it sends the wrong message. This is my restaurant and I set the standards here." But deep down, the first seeds of doubt were already taking root. Meanwhile, Barron walked slowly down the street, lost in his thoughts. The city buzzed around him, yet the noise only deepened his sense of isolation. After a few blocks, he reached a small park. Spotting an empty bench, he sat down, stretched out his legs, and pulled out his phone. His fingers hesitated briefly before typing the first message, to his mother. He gave her a brief summary of what had happened, assuring her that he was fine. Then he messaged a few close friends. He wasn't seeking sympathy. He just needed to process what had happened and hear other perspectives. The replies came quickly. One friend wrote, "That's ridiculous. They had no right to treat you like that." Another added, "You handled it way better than I would have. I would have lost it right there." As Barron scrolled through the messages, a thought began to form in his mind. It was still unrefined, But there was something significant about it, something that could turn this incident into something bigger. It wasn't about revenge or creating a public spectacle. Instead, he saw an opportunity to make a meaningful difference. If the restaurant was so afraid of symbols and statements, why not use this moment to promote unity and understanding? He stood up from the bench, a newfound determination in his eyes. Pulling out his phone again, he dialed a friend. His voice was calm but resolute. "I need your help. I have an idea." That call would be the first of many, marking the beginning of a new plan. Meanwhile, the restaurant was already being swept up in the storm of social media. One of the diners had taken a photo of the moment Barron was asked to leave and posted it online. The caption read, "Kicked Barron Trump out over a hat." Another user chimed in, "What happened to freedom of expression?" Apparently, not in this restaurant. The manager scrolling through his phone behind the bar felt his stomach tighten. The comments were a mix of outrage and defense. Some people criticized the restaurant harshly, while others sided with his decision. But the tide of negativity was growing stronger. "Let them talk," he muttered under his breath, trying to convince himself he'd done the right thing. But the words offered little comfort. The weight of regret was pressing down harder. By the time Barron returned home, the story had already begun spreading across news outlets and social platforms. A few local bloggers and influencers had picked it up, adding their own commentary. Some sided with him, while others debated the implications, splitting opinions down the middle. As Barron stared at the screen of his phone, he realized this was just the beginning. Barron glanced briefly at the messages, but didn't delve into them. His thoughts were elsewhere, reaching beyond the debates and arguments. He had no desire to escalate the conflict, to point fingers, or to provoke. Instead, he was consumed by an idea that grew inside him like a flame, something that could illuminate even the darkest corners. Sitting at a small wooden table in his apartment, Barron opened a leather-bound notebook. His fingers hovered over the pen for a moment before he began to write. Each line was an attempt to transform the incident into something meaningful, not division, but connection. He thought back not only to the manager with his firm but cold demeanor, but also to the onlookers, those who had watched the scene unfold, those who pretended not to notice, and those who had quietly taken pictures on their phones. Their silent judgments, curiosity, and perhaps even hidden empathy played over in his mind. What if, instead of conflict, we started a conversation? The thought illuminated everything else. He didn't want to argue. He wanted to talk. Then the idea struck him, as sudden and bright as a bolt of lightning. It would be a public fundraiser, not just any event, but one with profound purpose. He envisioned a gathering that would not only support underprivileged communities, but also serve as a platform for open dialogue, understanding, and acceptance. Grabbing his phone, Barron dialed a familiar number. "Hi, it's Barron Trump. I need some advice. I want to organize a charity event. Yes, it's urgent. Can we meet tomorrow?" There was a brief pause on the other end before the person agreed. Barron felt his resolve strengthen. That evening, he sat down to flesh out the details, building a clear vision. The venue was chosen deliberately. The event would take place right outside La Terrasse. It was a symbolic gesture to show that even places of conflict could be transformed into spaces for unity. One of his close friends agreed to help with the organization, and by midnight, the first steps had been taken. Phone calls, task lists, and planning meetings all swirled into a whirlwind of action. Meanwhile, tension was mounting inside the restaurant. The internet was ablaze. Users were sharing photos and videos, posting sharp criticisms. Some condemned the manager's actions, while others supported him. They call it a neutral space, but they kick people out for their choices. "That's hypocrisy," read one comment as the manager scrolled through his phone. He exhaled deeply, feeling his confidence in his decision falter. At first, he'd been steadfast, but now doubt crept into his thoughts like an unwelcome shadow. The restaurant's social media accounts were inundated with heated discussions. Some people canceled reservations, while others called for a boycott. The atmosphere inside La Terrasse had grown somber, and even its regular patrons began to avoid the place. Barron, however, was focused on the morning ahead. He knew the event wouldn't erase the memory of the conflict, but he believed it could offer something greater than division. It could be a step toward dialogue, understanding, and change. The next morning, the quiet street in front of the restaurant began to stir. Trucks unloaded tables and equipment, volunteers hung banners and set up a small stage. One banner bore the words, "Unity begins with dialogue." Barron stood at the edge of the sidewalk, watching the preparations. His expression was focused, but in his eyes was a glimmer of hope. Barron stood at the heart of the vibrant gathering, feeling the energy around him seep into his core. The banner above the stage, emblazoned with the bold words, "United we stand, building bridges, not walls," shone brightly against the blue sky. Every detail had been carefully planned to convey a central message: unity. Barron had enlisted the support of several local organizations focused on mentoring youth, fostering dialogue across social divides, and strengthening mutual understanding. This event wasn't just about raising funds for the sake of appearances. It was a living embodiment of hope for a better future. The square in front of La Terrasse had been transformed. Food trucks filled the air with mouth-watering aromas. The stage was set for performances by local musicians, and charity booths welcomed guests with warm smiles. Volunteers handed out programs detailing where the proceeds would go. By noon, the crowd had thickened. Families with children, young professionals, activists, and even passers-by drawn in by the music had gathered. Among them were a few social media influencers who had previously posted about the incident. Barron had ignored their posts, but now they had shown up in person. Taking the microphone, Barron stepped onto the stage. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice was steady. "Welcome, everyone," he began, scanning the faces in the crowd. "Yesterday, I was asked to leave this restaurant. The reason? My hat. That was their right, and I respect their policy, even if I don't agree with it. But this isn't a story about politics or clothing. This is a story about us, about our society." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "We've become too quick to judge each other, too eager to take sides and shut down conversations. But that's not who we are. We can be better." The crowd responded with a wave of applause. "This event isn't about me. It's not about the people who made a choice in that moment. It's about all of us, about learning to listen, to understand, and to come together. The funds we raise today will support programs that give people the tools to connect and learn from one another. Thank you for being here. You've proven that unity is stronger than division." The applause swelled into a roar, drowning out the noise of the street. Barron stepped off the stage, shaking hands and personally thanking attendees. His calm, thoughtful words resonated with everyone who listened. Many had come out of curiosity, but they left inspired by the idea that the world could be different. Meanwhile, inside La Terrasse, the atmosphere was entirely different. The manager stood by the window, watching the vibrant celebration unfold outside. His expression reflected an inner turmoil. He had never expected Barron to respond in this way, without anger or aggression, but with such clarity and conviction. The waiter, who had silently nodded along the day before, approached the bar and quietly said, "You should go out there and talk to him." The manager stiffened, as if the words had breached an invisible barrier. "It's not my fight," he replied with a trace of irritation. The waiter held his gaze, and after a pause added softly, "Maybe not, but it's definitely your opportunity." The manager didn't respond. He poured himself a glass of water, his hand trembling slightly, and took a sip. His eyes remained fixed on the window. The growing crowd, the laughter, and the music seeped through the restaurant's walls. Something about the scene struck a chord deep within him. A feeling he had long suppressed, regret, tinged with hope, began to surface. By this time, the fundraiser had become the talk of the town. Social media was buzzing with photos, videos, and live streams under hashtags like "number building bridges" and "number unity over division." Local news outlets covered the event, highlighting how Barron had turned a moment of conflict into a powerful lesson. The scene outside had captured the attention of more than just the locals. Reporters mingled in the crowd, eager to document every moment, and even representatives from larger media outlets arrived. People shared their impressions, and remarkably, no one seemed interested in rehashing the disagreement. Instead, the conversation revolved around the inspiration radiating from this simple yet profound gathering. The crowd stood still, captivated by the unusual sight. Two men, seemingly divided by principles and circumstances, now walk side by side as though the frayed threads of a broken dialogue were finally weaving into a new fabric. Barron guided the manager to a small table set beneath the shade of trees, away from the buzz and clamor of the event. There, with the soft strains of jazz playing in the background, the two men sat across from each other. The manager clasped his hands in his lap, his gaze drifting over the table, the ground, anywhere but directly meeting Barron's eyes. "You know," he began slowly, his voice restrained, "I didn't think it would go this far." Barron leaned forward slightly, listening intently but staying silent. The manager sighed deeply before continuing. "When I asked you to leave, I thought I was protecting my business, that I was making the right decision for everyone. But instead, I caused more harm." His voice wavered as he finally looked up, meeting Barron's gaze. "I was wrong." The two words, simple yet profound, hung in the air, seeming to drown out everything else around them. Barron nodded slowly, letting the weight of the admission settle before he responded. "Admitting a mistake isn't easy, especially when it's become so public. I respect your courage." The manager shook his head. "This isn't courage, it's necessity. What I see out there," he gestured toward the lively event, "is what I've always wanted for our restaurant. A place that brings people together, not pushes them apart. But I destroyed that myself." Barron placed a hand on the table, not demanding attention, but offering quiet support. "You haven't destroyed it entirely. As long as you're willing to build bridges instead of walls, there's always a way forward." The manager lowered his head, the inner conflict evident on his face. "And what if no one believes me? What if everything I do just makes things worse?" Barron gave him a soft, genuine smile. "People might surprise you. Sure, not everyone will believe in you right away. But that's not what matters. What matters is that you genuinely want to make things better, and it starts with a small step. Like this conversation." The manager looked at him as if weighing every word. Then suddenly he extended his hand, a silent, unspoken agreement. "Maybe that step," he said quietly, "is working with you. To at least try to fix this." Barron didn't hesitate. He shook the man's hand firmly, his gaze steady and encouraging. "Let's try." The crowd, which had respectfully observed the moment from a distance, suddenly stirred to life. Someone began clapping, tentatively at first, then louder and louder, until the applause spread through the entire gathering. It felt like more than approval. It was a celebration of reconciliation, rare and beautiful. The manager, barely able to suppress his emotions, nodded at Barron, and for the first time in what felt like ages, smiled. The sun dipped lower in the sky, bathing everything in a warm, golden glow. The music, the laughter, the hum of conversation filled the air. But at the heart of it all stood two men who had made the impossible possible. They had begun to build a bridge. Barron stood quietly, watching as the last of the guests dispersed, leaving behind an atmosphere filled with a gentle joy and a sense of hope. His friends and family gathered around him, exchanging soft words of gratitude and praise, but he seemed lost in his own thoughts. A faint, peaceful smile lingered on his face, as though he had finally found the answer to a question that had weighed on him over the past few days. The manager, still standing nearby, glanced once more at the dispersing crowd, their animated chatter now filling the city streets. He took a deep breath, realizing that he had just witnessed and become a part of something far greater than he had ever imagined. Barron approached him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "This is just the beginning," Barron said, giving the manager's shoulder a light squeeze. "I know," the manager replied, smiling. "But for the first time, I feel like I can look at the future differently."